Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Eduyot. We are up to Perek Daled Mishnah Chet. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilu Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Ranbai Veliyahu ben Mordechai Israelov Chana bad Miriam Sason ben Ryan Yehoshua ben Shifra Menuchatam began Eden Amen and Leavdil ben Chaim lechaim v'derefua shelemav Daniel Shalom ben Rosa betor shar Cholei Yisrael and Achlama me'erav Binyamin Or Tzion Chai ben Dvorah. The next dispute between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel appears in Yevamot chapter 1 Mishnah 4. If a married man dies without children, there is a mitzvah for one of his brothers to marry his widow, called Yibum, or freer to marry others through the ceremony of Chalitza, which is the removal of the shoe. Although a brother's former wife is usually considered an erva, a relative that one is not allowed to marry under penalty of karet, the Torah makes an exception and permits marrying a brother's widow for purposes of Yibum. However, if the widow is also an ervatim in another way, for example, she is his daughter, meaning the dead brother was married to his own niece, the living brother's daughter, which is permitted, then no exception is made. The brother is not allowed to marry her and she is free to marry others without chalitza. If, however, there is at least one brother to whom she is not an erva, then that brother has the mitzvah to perform either yibum or chalitza. Our Mishnah discusses a case where a man died childless and left several widows. The Torah permits a man to marry more than one wife. Approximately 1,000 years ago, Rabbeinu Gershom of Germany banned this practice, and his ban was accepted by all of Ashkenazic Jewry. This is discussed in Shulchan Aruch and Ramah, Even Ezer, chapter 1, halachot 10 and 11. The general rule for a man who dies without children and leaves a number of widows is that one of the living brothers performs Yibum Mechalitza with only one of the widows, and the others are then free to marry anyone. Right, so again, our Mishnah discusses a case where a man died childless and left several widows, one of whom is an erva to his living brother. The erva herself is exempt from Yibum and Chalitza, unless there is a brother to whom she is not an erva. Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel disagree regarding the law for the other widows, the co-wives of the erva. Bet Shammai matirin et atzarot la'achim. Bet Shammai permit the co-wives of an erva to the brothers, meaning they rule that a brother may perform yibum with his erva's co-wife. Therefore, even if he is the only living brother, she may not marry others without chalitza. Bet Shammai hold that although the erva herself is exempt from yibum and chalitza, the co-wives are not free to marry unless one of them does yibum or chalitza. Ubet Hillel osrin, but Bet Hillel forbid the co-wives to the brother, and if he is the only living brother, they are free to marry others without chalitza. According to Bet Hillel, not only is the erva herself exempt from yibum and chalitza, but so are her co-wives. Bet Hillel derived this law from a biblical verse. In fact, since there is no mitzvah of yibum and chalitza, the living brother is forbidden to marry any of the co-wives, since they are his brother's former wives. The Mishnah notes some other practical consequences of this dispute. Chaltzu, if one of the co-wives of the erva perform chalitza with the living brother, Bet Shammai poslin mina keuna. Bet Shammai consider this to be a meaningful chalitza, and therefore disqualify that co-wife from marrying into the keuna, meaning from marrying a kohen. By rabbinic law, a kohen may not marry a woman who received chalitza, she resembles a divorcee. Bet Hillel machshirin, but Bet Hillel considers this to be a meaningless chalitza since it was unnecessary, and therefore consider her eligible to marry a kohen. A second consequence in which the reverse is true, Bet Hillel disqualify her, and Bet Hillel disqualify her, and Bet Shammai consider her eligible. Nityabmu, if one of the co-wives was taken by the brother in Yibum and he then died, Bet Shammai machshirin, Bet Shammai consider her eligible to marry a kohen, since this yibum was entirely permitted. Bet Hillel poslin, but Bet Hillel disqualify her from marrying a kohen, since the yibum was forbidden, and a woman who cohabits with a man to whom she is forbidden is rendered a zonah and forbidden to kohanim. This dispute created a situation in which the kohanim from Bet Shammai might be concerned about marrying women from the families of Bet Hillel, and vice versa. Since there were women that one side considered permitted to Kohanim, whom the other side considered forbidden. Similarly, there were women from each side that even non-Kohanim could not marry. According to Bet Shammai, a co-wife of an Rava is not allowed to marry anyone without performing chalitza with the living brother, whereas according to Bet Hillel, she is free to marry without it. On the other hand, according to Bet Shammai, a man is allowed to perform yibum with his Erva's co-wife, whereas according to Bet Hillel, the Erva's co-wife is herself considered an Erva, so any child that comes from this marriage is a mamzer, a product of a union that the Torah considers an Erva. A Jew of proper lineage may not marry a mamzer, as says in Dvarim, chapter 23, verse 3. The Mishnah teaches how the families dealt with this. And even though Bet Hillel disqualifies certain people from marriage and Bet Shammai consider them eligible for marriage, so families on each side of the dispute included women that its own side considered permitted, but the others considered forbidden. Lo nimneu Bet Shammai milisan nashim mi Bet Hillel. Bet Shammai did not refrain from marrying women of Bet Hillel. V'lo Bet Hillel milisan nashim mi Bet Shammai. Nor did Bet Hillel refrain from marrying women of Bet Shammai, because they always told each other about women that the other side would consider forbidden, so they would not marry them. And the Mishnah further illustrates how disputes between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel did not negatively affect their interaction. And despite all the ta'or items and tameh items that one side of the dispute considered ta'or and the other side considered tameh, lo nimnu liot osim ta'orot elu al gav elu. Each side did not refrain from preparing ta'or foods and utensils they borrowed from each other, because each side would always inform the other regarding utensils that the borrower would consider tameh. And that is the end of Mishnah Chet. The next dispute, which is found in Yevamot chapter 3, Mishnah 5, also involves the laws of Yibum. Under biblical law, the only way to do Yibum is by cohabitating with the Yevamah. However, for the sake of propriety, the rabbis instituted that the Yavam should first perform an act of Kiddushin with her. Kiddushin is the first stage of marriage for a regular woman, as explained in chapter 4, Mishnah 7. This pre-Yibum act of Kiddushin is called Ma'amar. Once one brother performs Ma'amar with the Yevamah, none of the other brothers may marry her. The Tanaim and Mishnah Ted disagree whether Ma'amar is the full status of Kiddushin or whether it is something less. Shelosha Achim, there were three brothers. Shnai mem nisuim l'shtei achayot. Two of them were married to two sisters. V'chad mufne, and one was unmarried. Met echad mi balei achayot. The husband of one of the sisters died childless. V'asaba mufne ma'amar, and the unmarried brother performed ma'amar with her. V'achach met achiv hasheni, and afterward his other brother died childless. At this point, both sisters are widows and have fallen for Yibum to the third brother, the one who was previously unmarried. The first of the sisters to be widowed is Beshrotim through Ma'amar. The law in this case is subject to dispute. Bet Shammai say Ishto imo, the Ma'amar wife of the unmarried brother remains with him. And the other widow goes out free to marry without chalitza on account of being his Ma'amar wife's sister. Bet Shammai hold that Ma'amar is a completely effective marriage, meaning it is effective even on the biblical level, like Kiddushin for a regular woman. Therefore, once the unmarried brother performed Ma'amar with the first sister, she became his full wife, and when the second sister lost her husband, she was an ervatim, since she was his wife's sister, and was therefore freed. But Bet Hillel say that Ma'amar is not completely effective as a marriage. It is not effective on the biblical level, and it is only rabbinically a marriage. The second sister therefore also has a Yibum bond with him. Since the Ma'amar wife is not biblically married to him, she cannot block the biblical Yibum bond of the second widow from taking effect. A rabbinic marriage cannot change her biblical status. Motzi et ishto beget v'chalitza. As a result, he must send out his Ma'amar wife with both a get to undo the Ma'amar and chalitza to remove the Yibum bond with her. Ve'et eshad achiv b'chalitza, and he must send out his brother's wife, the second wife, with chalitza to remove his Yibum bond with her. Bet Hillel hold that Ma'amar is considered only a partial marriage, therefore it is not strong enough to prevent the second sister's Yibum bond from taking effect as well. Since both sisters now have the Yibum bond with him, the law is that it may not marry either of them. The rabbis decreed that the Yibum bond should be treated like a marriage in some respects. Therefore, just as a man may not marry his wife's close relatives, such as her sister, he is rabbinically forbidden to marry the close relatives of a woman with whom he has a Yibum bond. Therefore, he must remove his Yibum bonds with both of them through chalitza. Since the prohibition for him to marry either one of the sisters is only rabbinic, they still need chalitza. However, since the first sister is partially married to him through Ma'amar, he must also give her a get to free her from this partial marriage. Zoi Shamru, it is about this case that the sages said, Ilo al ishto, woe to him over his wife, whom he must now divorce through no fault of his own. Vilu al eshed achiv, and woe to him over his brother's wife, whom he may also not marry. And that is the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.